Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming along to I think this is the second edition of the SEN conference. Really important subject matter. And pleased to actually welcome our speakers, also fellow partners in terms of Novium, Pinnacle, and McAvoy, Galliford, and Share Agenda for supporting the conference. We've got about 45 minutes. I think we've got 15 minutes each on the presentations. André is going to be talking, he's obviously from the Department of Education, he's going to be talking about policy, and Mark is going to be talking about the guidance around that policy. And we're going to save sort of 10, 15 minutes at the end for any questions. So thanks and welcome, everyone.
Am I on? Good. Good morning. It's always a bit daunting, I feel, when you stand in front of a lecture room like this. It feels very formal and very more academic. And actually, I think we're about the real world. I say this because yesterday I was at Durham University. They've got a massive neurodiversity department there, which is really taking off, doing lots of research. So I went to talk to them about our priorities, how their research could inform our SEN and disability developments, and then they presented to me some short snippets about research they're currently involved in about improving the outcomes for children and young people in schools with neurodiversity. So it was a really interesting thing, but it was a massive one of these rooms, bigger than this, and again, quite daunting. So anyway, welcome. I'm André. I'm from the DfE, and I work in the SEN division. And I'm the professional advisor. Throughout my career, I have been a teacher in schools and an educational psychologist, a leader in local authorities, planning new provision, closing some provision, and then I've been working at a national level for some time. And I've been working very much on the 2014 reforms, which are the bedrock of the statutory system for provision for children with special educational needs. And also, when I was here last year, and I think there were a few familiar faces, but I think most of you were not here last year, I was flagging up our improvement plan, which we were imminently about to publish. We subsequently published it, so I will say a little bit more about that. And really, the focus is towards a more inclusive mainstream education system. So what I want to do is share some of the reasons why we want to have an even sharper focus on a more inclusive education system, and certainly the feedback from research yesterday from children with neurodiversity was very much about them wanting a mainstream school that was more supportive and more flexible to their individual needs. So, the SEN system, again, I'm sure you've all become aware, if you didn't know much about SEN as a member of the public 2 years ago, I think over the last 2 years there's been a lot of national publicity and interest in special educational needs, if only because it's costing a lot more money, isn't it? And a lot of councils are in some difficulty because of the increasing costs of the system. I'll come back to that a bit later, but the SEN system is, I think, being characterized at the moment by that single word, more. There are more children on SEN support. SEN support is that lower level of intervention with children, usually in the school system where children are identified and provided for by schools. Over nearly 1.2 million children in our schools in England. That's nearly 14% of all children in England have an identified special educational need that requires some form of intervention at school level. We've also seen a big increase in the number of EHC plans that are held by local authorities, a 10% increase. Education, health and care plans are for those children and young people who have the more severe needs that require additional provision from the local authority and possibly from health and social care services. A 10% increase in 1 year is a very big increase. Also, for those of you in planning special provision, a reminder that children only go to special schools if they have an education, health and care plan. So we've got, and I think last year I was flagging up that I predicted that we would pass a major milestone in the history of special educational needs, and we did. We went over 500,000 education, health and care plans. And there'll be some of you who remember the days of the Statement of Special Educational Needs, which was superseded in 2014 by an education, health and care plan. So those of you who think statements still, change your thinking to EHC plans, but they're not that different in terms of the statutory requirements on local authorities. So over 500,000 education, health and care plans. And my prediction, the data will be published in May, my prediction is that will be more. And I think the question is, will it be more than 10% increase, or will it be lower? I think that's the thing we need to keep an eye open for. Assessments are meant to be done in 20 weeks. That's proving quite a challenge at the moment for local authorities, mainly, I think, because of that increase. They've got a huge volume of increase and the capacity to undertake the assessments, both within the local authority, the health and social care services, and educational psychology services, for example, is challenging. So the volume is leading to challenges in efficiency. There's an increase in the number of children in specialist placements, in placements out of mainstream school. And I'll share some more precise data on that shortly. We've also got more challenges to the system. You could typify that by summarizing more appeals to the tribunal, more complaints to the ombudsman, as increased parental dissatisfaction with the way the system is working. And we've also seen a huge increase in the SEN budget, the high needs budget. Now, it may not always feel like that on the ground, but it's undoubtedly the case that the government has put in 60% more money into special educational needs in 5 years. I challenge you to find another public service that has seen such a big increase in 5 years. And I'm sure if I stood in front of an SEN dedicated audience 5 years ago and said, over the next 5 years, there's going to be 60% more money coming in, everyone would have thought, our troubles are over. But we've put in 50% more, and our troubles do not seem yet to be over. So let's look at that graph about plans. Well, really, that's probably just what I was, a graphical representation of what I was just saying. The very steep increase in the number of statutory documents, either statements or education, health and care plans as now. So it's rising and rising and rising. It's been rising at about 8 to 10% for the last few years. Interestingly, if I'd drawn the graph back to 2004, 2003, it would have been about the same. It had been very stable for a long time. So I think this increase is quite a surprise and quite a shock to the system. But undoubtedly, you can see the rise. But the challenge we have, we've got one national system, we've got one code of practice, one set of laws, and yet it's rolled out very differently from one authority to another. This is a graph of 151 local authorities about the number of EHC plans they held in 2021. I've taken this from a green paper. If we replicated it for the last year's data, it would still be the same. Massive variation from one local authority to another. And I think that's really important to try and understand that when you're working with an individual authority. Where do they sit in relation to others? What's the benchmarking? What's that telling us about what's going on in a local authority? It's very hard to put rhyme or reason to explain why some authorities have got over 5% of their school population with an education, health and care plan, and some authorities have got below 3%. One thing I can say to you categorically is it's nothing to do with the socioeconomic composition of those authorities. It's not that the poorest are on one end and the richest are on another. It's got nothing to do with that. It's not possible to identify one or two single measures to account for that. But it is important when you're talking to local authorities about their situation to try and understand where they are in relation to the national average of 4.2 versus that. Would you deal, it depends what the issue is that you're working with them on, but might you approach a local authority differently if you knew they were on that end to that end? But there is too much inconsistency. And one of our aims in the improvement plan I will be talking about is to try to make the system more consistent so that there is a more consistent experience for children and families as well as education settings wherever they are in the country. But there is massive variation. There's also massive variation within an individual authority in relation to the number of EHC plans in some schools, and in particular to the numbers of children on SEN support. Schools identify children on SEN support, 2 schools next door to each other with the same apparent level of intake, same level of funding, are identifying very different levels of special educational needs. Again, we want to put in place measures to try to narrow that discrepancy. We also have, and this goes back to the 1981 Education Act, which really was the sort of bedrock of the special educational needs support system. We say that the government is committed to the inclusive education of disabled children and young people and the progressive removal of barriers and participation in mainstream education. That's what we say. That's the beginning of our code of practice, which everyone is meant to follow. The law, the Children and Families Act, there is a presumption in that mainstream is the option for children with special educational needs, and there is a right for parents to express a preference for mainstream schools. If they do that, it's very, very hard for a local authority to say no. So there are some children in our mainstream schools with incredibly complex needs because their parents have asked for that, and the local authority has agreed to that, and the school is working with them, and the adaptations, etc., have been made. There's also a lot of research evidence that shows there are many, many benefits for mainstream education for those with special educational needs, but also for those without special educational needs, because you will hear worries from schools at times. Well, if we have more children with special educational needs, it might have a detrimental effect on the efficient education of other children in our school. There's absolutely no research evidence that we can find to support that. It's one of those sort of assumptions that isn't validated by research. I said I'd give you a bit of data on specialist placements. Well, this is what the raw data is saying. So you can see, and many of you here, I'm sure, have been involved in the planning and design and hopefully the opening of new specialist provision. You can see why it's needed, the huge increase in the raw numbers in state-funded special schools. That term includes local authority maintained schools as well as academy special schools. So there's been over 21,000 more children placed in special schools, bearing in mind that special schools tend to be about 100 on average. Some are a bit smaller, some are a bit bigger, but that's a lot of specialist schools. Of course, not all those additional placements are in new schools. Many of them are adaptations, additions, extensions to existing special schools. You can see as well that the largest percentage increase is in the independent special school placements. And that's, again, gone up nearly 40%. Of course, those tend to cost a lot more money to local authorities, and often for children who are sent there, they're far distant. Not always, but far distant placements. And local authorities are very keen to make sure that, as far as possible, they're able to provide the range of provision locally that these children need. So most local authority strategies, and indeed our improvement plan, is about trying to make the local provision better, more accessible, so thereby obviating the need for ever-increasing numbers of placements in the independent special school sector. Here's a graph that's exactly the same message as that other graph. But this is about local authority behaviours in placements in special schools. A salutary note, the NAO is the National Audit Office, probably known to some of you as the Audit Commission from years ago. In 2019, they said the main reason local authorities have overspent their high needs budget is because they're placing more children in special schools, or more children are attending special schools. We, in our green paper, said, again, the same message as about plans. A child or young person may be effectively supported in a mainstream school in one area of the country, but would be placed in a specialist setting if they were living somewhere else. And this graph really, I think, highlights a major issue for us in promoting that slide I was talking about, the commitment to an inclusive mainstream placement. Because you can see in these authorities, of all the pupils they have in schools, less than 1% of the total school population are in special schools, whereas at this end, it's 2.5%, going up for 3%. It's got nothing to do with children or their needs. That's one thing we can be sure of. Another thing, it's like the other one, it's nothing to do with socioeconomic composition in the local areas. If you're planning provision and you start looking at this, what would you do if you knew that the authority was on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side? Would it make a difference to decision-making? Certainly at a very senior level, if you're faced with a choice of choosing between approving a special school between two authorities, and one was on that end and one was on the other end, what would you choose? Again, would you take this graph into consideration? It's very difficult in terms of decision-making because both those proposals, the local authorities probably need them the most. How do you choose? Very difficult to work through that. I have talked about financial issues. I'm not going to go into those in too much detail, but many local authorities are in financial difficulty. They've got high needs deficits and are struggling to keep afloat. We've got a safety valve program, which is government funding for those with the largest deficits. It's as simple as that, a spreadsheet, who's got the largest deficits, we invite them to be part of a safety valve program. It involves a contract between the local authority and the government for actions to manage their budgets more efficiently, take actions, and so on, which we support with in terms of approving or not, and we have a very tight monitoring system in terms of progress. For those not quite at the more severe end, we've been supporting them slightly differently through a Delivering Better Value program. This provides more targeted support to those local authorities, helps them diagnose what their issues are, helps them work with stakeholders, and provides additional funding for some additional capacity to deal with their situation. Also, the ESFA, the Educational Skills and Funding Agency, do have a tailored support and challenge. We keep an eye on budget issues in every local authority, and where issues seem to be arising, our ESFA colleagues do provide support. That's the high needs block. That's really reaffirming what I was saying about a 60% increase in the government's funding for high needs and schools. I'll turn briefly to our improvement plan. The problems, as I have been illustrating, outcomes are poor. Despite all this hard work, despite all this energy, despite all the resources, outcomes aren't good for children with SEN. Navigating the system, finding your way around it, particularly as a parent or a carer, can be challenging. Too much inconsistency, and we do have to say this system is not delivering value for money. We published an improvement plan in March last year, and the vision of that is to create a much more inclusive society, to help make mainstreams more welcoming and more supportive, and offering a more flexible approach to children's needs. We want to fulfill children's potential. We know we have to build parents' trust. Parents are such an integral part of the system in terms of co-production, working with parents, and listening to their feedback, and then hopefully acting on their feedback. And of course, we do need to provide financial sustainability. Now, it's not for me to say, but if I was a gambling man, I would say that we're not going to see 60% increase in the next 5 years into special educational needs. But who am I to say that? So improvement measures, we want to introduce national standards. We want to try to set out more clearly an exposition of what we would expect, what type of provision we would expect for a child with particular presenting needs. Because at the moment, it's a bit of that's probably contributing to a postcode lottery. There isn't enough understanding or shared vision about what provision a child presenting with X difficulties and Y challenges should be receiving as a matter of routine. We know that we need to improve leadership in the system and drive better shared responsibility and accountability. We're looking at more local authority partnerships. Most local authorities have got some form of SEN board or something, but they're all made up of different people with different agendas. We want to try and standardize that. There's a lot of capital investment, 2.6 billion from last year, the last 2 years, and we're now in the third year of that 2.6 billion, which I think many of you will be aware of. We want to standardize EHC plan templates. The way that EHC plans are presented, there's 152 different ways of doing that. People say the system would be better if there was one single national way of doing that. We also want to help parents in their choice of placements. When parents get a draft plan, they're invited to tell the local authority the name of the school they'd like their child to attend, but they're not given much more guidance than that. We're going to try to, at that point, we're testing this out in a number of authorities, give them a range of about 3 or 4 schools that the local authority thinks might be good ones for them to choose. They can ignore it if they wish, but it's a chance for parents to have a more focused set of options presented. Supported internships, a program for those older young people with very complex needs, working with employers to give them job opportunities and experiences that are supported by additional resource. We know there's a lot to do in terms of supporting mainstream practice through high quality teaching and initial teacher training. We want to try to make sure that support is more available at the point of need. One of the tenets, one of the central principles, I think, behind an inclusive system is that you take the support to the child rather than a child to the support. Child to the support means placements out of mainstream schools. Support to the child means delivering in situ and helping there. Alternative provision, AP. We've got a lot of developments in alternative provision. It's a bit patchworky, and we need to do more to make that a more coherent strategy in every local authority, working very closely with school leaders and having a more consistent funding streams. We're also going to be introducing dashboards with data on so that people can understand better the types of data I was presenting and where they stand in all of that. We also, I talked about the rise in tribunals. We're going to see what we can do to strengthen mediation, which is a process which comes when a parent does disagree with a local authority decision, but before it goes to a tribunal. We want to try and see if we can strengthen that. Where that option is taken up, there's a very high rate of problem resolution at local authority level. So I'm going to conclude now. It is a time of challenges, we can't deny that. There's lots of real challenges out there, lots of real issues. It's coming to the fore almost every day in the media. We know that we need to focus on experience. It's what people feel and experience every day in school, what children experience, how their behaviors are managed on a day-to-day basis, the response of schools to behaviors. How can we make that experience? How can parents feel more welcome in the system? How can their views be taken forward more meaningfully? So we do need to secure the confidence of parents in the system. But the reason to be cheerful, when we consulted on a green paper, when we brought out that improvement plan, pretty much everyone wants to see a more supportive, inclusive mainstream system. We may have different ideas about how to achieve it, but the basic goal of achieving it does seem to be something that everyone wants to see happening. And we can all make a contribution to that from different perspectives. Thank you. I'm going to pass over to my colleague Mark, and after that, we'll be able to take some questions. Is that right? Yeah? Okay.
Thank you, André. It's always really good to hear what you have to say. That was an excellent presentation. So I'll be talking about the buildings and settings that facilitate meeting the policies and challenges that André has presented. I'm Mark Pratt. I'm a design advisor at the department. I've been in my role for 5 years as of Monday, and I lead on SEND and inclusive design. This slide outlines the topics that I'll be covering over the next 15 minutes. Usually, I'll present a number of precedents, but today you'll be hearing from leaders from the establishments that I usually speak about. You'll be hearing from the architects. So I don't have to cover many of those settings, and it promises to be a really excellent day. The image on the right is of Trent View College, one of our recently completed special schools. It's a non-ambulant special school. It is also a passive house school. It offers, it has a sixth form vocational offer. It has really brilliant landscaping, as you can see there, a hydrotherapy pool, a vehicle workshop, and a training kitchen. It is focused on preparing pupils for work and independent living. The design team at the department has been in place for since 1947. We are the keepers of standards, the producers of guidance, the providers of advice and assurance, and we support delivery programs. We gather data through building performance evaluations, and we make evidence-based decisions. And we embark on a continuous cycle of improvement to ensure that the education estate remains resilient and sustainable. We also undertake building and use studies as part of post-occupancy evaluation. We're a multidisciplinary team, and we're absolutely passionate about what we do. We're made up of a mix of architects, structural engineers, and mechanical engineers. And a large proportion of the guidance that we produce is related to environmental comfort and the energy performance of buildings. The image on the right is from a while back, from 2019, where our team went to a school in Hounslow, and we were exploring play and how we can facilitate play in education. That school happens to be under the Heathrow flight path, and there are features in the playground, underground features in the playground that are quite magical. And I urge you to look that up. Just yesterday, I was privileged enough to visit Swiss Cottage School. It's a very large, broad-range special school in Camden that caters for 260 pupils. I was joined by Karen, Emily, and Mark from Ireland, who got off the plane and went straight to the school because they're as passionate as we are about ensuring that the right guidance and standards are put in place. Being evidence-led is key to meeting our aims. One morning last week, I opened the fridge and I was met with this sight. My son, Adam, had labeled his jam donuts in an effort to protect them from his younger sister, who also loves jam donuts. Adam is really, really excited about his future prospects, and he's just received offers from universities. He's at that stage in his career. It really made me laugh because it reminded me of my uni days in the early 90s. looking at his spelling, he might be planning on writing for American journals rather than our local scientific journals, but we'll see. Now, I've shared this image because we're here to establish how we can facilitate pupils meeting their potential and realizing that potential. Now, university is not for everybody, we know that. And different pupils' potential will be realized in different ways. Inclusion, as has been mentioned, is about facilitating education and removing barriers, and offering choice. That is critical. The right education in the right place can lead to further education or higher education, or just living more independently. It could also lead to the introduction to the workplace, as we saw at Trent View College, the focus of that provision is all about preparation for the workplace. And for those of you that didn't know, on that note, this week is National Apprenticeship Week. The department's two main delivery programs are the School Rebuilding Program and the Free Schools Program. About 50 schools are announced every year on the School Rebuilding Program to have blocks replaced or have the entire school rebuilt. The Free School Program, on the other hand, has waves of schools, and in 2019, we announced a wave of 39 special schools and AP. Those are well underway. They're in construction. Some have been completed. And Trent View was one of those. Last year, wave 3 for special schools and AP was announced, and local authorities could bid for new schools. I've been advised that these projects will go live in spring of this year. It is absolutely fantastic that special schools have been added to our net capacity assessments. Many of you may have been involved in the pilot, which was launched last year. The results will help us understand the capacity of the SEND estate. An assessment tool has been developed that is very similar to the mainstream net capacity assessment tool. This was developed by my colleague, Beach Williamson, some 20 years ago, and he has been key to the success of this new tool. There are just over 1,000 special schools, state-funded special schools in England, and most of them will have had their net capacity assessments undertaken by September. Because classroom occupancy in a special school is dependent on need, the capacity of special schools won't be conveyed as an absolute, like in mainstream schools, but as a range. Even so, this data will be very, very useful. In future, we may assess schools differently. We may look at improving existing buildings as a focus. As mainstream schools become more inclusive, the needs of the pupils attending special schools becomes more severe. And certainly at Swiss Cottage yesterday, we were told of the trend, or of this trend, that the needs of the pupils are becoming more complex. This slide shows the graduated approach to SEN provision. The statistics on schools, pupils, and their characteristics are absolutely fascinating. I certainly find them really fascinating, and they can be found on our government website. What I picked up from these statistics is that only 39% of pupils with education, health, and care plans are in our special schools, the state-maintained special schools. That means that 2 to 3% of pupils attending mainstream schools have an education and healthcare plan. That is about 1 pupil in each and every classroom of 30. And then, as you know, there's a much bigger number receiving SEN support. Now, what surprises me about this fact is the low number of mainstream schools that have resource provision and SEN units. That said, though, there are a number of local authorities, such as Norfolk County Council, taking strides to improve the situation. So they have a program of introducing more SEN units and much more resource provision. And this is about introducing places at schools that are guaranteed this funding. So it's not the same as pupils with an education healthcare plan whose numbers fluctuate at a school. This is about a set number of places that will receive resource provision. What that means is that as architects, we can provide the accommodation for that set number of places. Another surprising statistic is that 25% of pupils in alternative provision have an education and healthcare plan. Maybe that shouldn't be that surprising. Some local authorities offer a very inclusive mainstream provision, which means that the entire pedagogy of the school is adapted to be more inclusive. And this means that they don't have formal resource provision or SEN units. It does make things slightly more challenging for us because the resource provision and SEN units haven't been formalized, or those places haven't been formalized. And so it's more difficult to determine the accommodation requirements for those more inclusive schools. But it is something that we need to work on, and we need to learn from those local authorities. This slide shows what the SEN Improvement Plan means for the school estate. It's quite difficult to translate the requirements into building terms. And so when reading the SEN Improvement Plan, you really need to read between the lines to determine exactly what it means for the estate. But as has been mentioned, the focus is on making mainstream schools more inclusive. Perhaps we need some guides for existing schools, existing buildings, on how to make them more inclusive. And that is something that we at the department need to look at. One of the main points of the SEND review was that we need the right provision in the right place. And that is why we are still seeing a number of new special schools being built. In one of the sessions later today, you're going to be shown an excellent example of an alternative provision, SILS 3 by Tim Ronald. I was lucky enough to be shown around that provision by Tim, and what it showed me is that the involvement of an architect in establishing or designing the provision makes all the difference. I think you'll be very impressed with what you've shown. Improved sensory environments enable more children and young people with special educational needs to access learning alongside their peers. Examples of reasonable adjustments include adaptations to the acoustics, which can help hearing and understanding and make spaces feel calmer. Small, quiet spaces inside the building, and quiet outdoor areas can be a significant asset, not only to those pupils with special educational needs, but to all pupils. Furthermore, more inclusive environments will surely help attendance figures. Who could resist going to a building with a feature like this in it? I think that's absolutely beautiful. As has been mentioned, different local authorities have different approaches to SEN provision. And our standards and guidance cover all of those approaches. And there's no approach that we favor over another. That said, there appear to be two main approaches. The one is the provision of SEN-specific special schools, and the other is to provide broad-range special schools. There are pros and cons to both. The more specialist SEN-specific special schools become centers of excellence, or they have the potential to become centers of excellence. Broad-range schools, on the other hand, could be viewed as being more inclusive. But there is a danger in that they could become too big. Something noted at Swiss Cottage is that they're reaching their maximum capacity in terms of what size a special school should be. They have 260 pupils, as mentioned. Effectively, I think what local authorities need to look at is maximum school capacities of in the region of 100 to 120 for each stage of education. So 120 in primary, 120 in secondary, as a maximum. The norm should probably be a bit lower than that. Certainly, our SEN-specific schools have numbers around 80. And alternative provision should probably be even smaller at around 64. We have had some applications for much larger alternative provision, which is going to be interesting, to say the least. What I would say is always get the input of experienced educationists and experienced multi-academy trusts. They're the ones that are working with the pupils. They're the ones that know what provision is right for them in terms of buildings and building capacities, and classroom capacities too. I'm going to mention that in the Building Bulletin 104 guidance, there are two types of schools mentioned. We call them ambulance schools and non-ambulance schools. Now, the first thing I need to point out is that all our schools are inclusive. The main difference is that non-ambulance special schools have more non-ambulant pupils. So more pupils with wheelchairs or using assistive devices. Some of them have up to 4 different devices, some even more, that they use throughout their school day. That results in huge amounts of storage requirements. Also, a lot of these mobility aids need to be charged. There are also additional hygiene and sanitary requirements that a non-ambulance special school would require far more than an ambulance special school. So it's important to make a very clear decision at the start of the process in deciding what provision you are going to be calling for or applying for, so that the correct formulae can be used, because it's not a case of designing part of your building to certain formulae and part of your building to another. Even though in a broad range ambulance special school, you could have a wing for pupils with PMLD, profound and multiple learning difficulties, usually pupils with complex health needs, and generally non-ambulant, but not always. Right, I'm going to speak about the controversial subject of standard designs. This is about us wanting to provide examples of how to comply with our output specification, including achieving net zero carbon in operation. Standard designs are not about one size fits all. That is something that I need to emphasize. It's about standardizing parts of the building that are configurable and flexible. We want to be able to provide architects with examples of good practice in safeguarding and safe access arrangements. Also, we know from speaking to educationists what works in terms of adjacency and accommodation to match current delivery and curriculum needs for schools. We're developing clusters of space which need to be balanced with access to the outside. The outside environment is critically important. St. Mary's Biophilic Primary School actually has covered external circulation, and it's going to have a beautifully enhanced landscape once it is complete. That is it under construction at the moment. The other thing is that through standardization of clusters of space, there is more flexibility when it comes to adapting a school to different cohorts or different or changes in the needs of pupils over time. And you're going to hear about that in sessions later today too. Now, because one size does not fit all, we have something called the school-specific brief template, which I encourage delivery teams to look up, have a look at on .gov.uk. The template has a number of prompts that cover all aspects of the school. It consists of two sections: the strategic part, which is about the provision needs, the school vision, the educational drivers, etc. That part is covered in educational terms, whereas the project-specific part, or the project brief, is covered in architectural terms, and that is how those strategies are met in the building. As I said, I encourage local authorities to steer their delivery teams to our documentation on .gov.uk. I've spoken about facilitating children and young people realizing their potential, but this slide is about us realizing our potential. There are some excellent SEN-specific exemplars to learn from. And thankfully, we're joined by a number of teams who work in these exemplar buildings. There are members from local authorities here that you'll get to chat to about buildings that are working really well in their authorities. We can realize our potential by sharing knowledge and going through this continuous cycle of improvement. What I want to say is make every day a learning day, and especially today, and enjoy the sessions that follow. Thank you very much.